The phone rang at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the voice on the other end belonged to a man I'd never spoken to before. He introduced himself as Gerald Fenton, Regional Operations Director at Kessler Brandt Logistics. And he was crying. Not the restrained, professional kind of crying you might expect from a corporate executive. This was the wet, shattered sobbing of someone whose world had just cracked open beneath him. He kept saying my wife's name. Dana, Dana, oh God. Donna and I stood in my kitchen holding a coffee mug that was slowly going cold, trying to understand why my wife's former boss was calling me at dawn to fall apart. She was the only one who knew the systems, Gerald said between gasps. The only one who understood how the routing architecture connected to the distribution grid. We have 72 drivers on the road right now, and we cannot reach 14 of them. And she was the only one who... I stopped him. Gerald, Dana quit 8 days ago. She doesn't work for you anymore. The silence that followed was enormous. Then he said something that made no sense at the time, but would come to define everything that followed. You don't understand. The roads are wrong. The GPS is wrong. Something is happening, and I need her to come back. Dana was upstairs, still sleeping. She'd quit Kessler Brandt the previous Monday after 11 years, 3 promotions, and 1 catastrophic disagreement with the new VP of Operations, who wanted to gut the safety protocols she'd spent a decade building. She walked out with her dignity intact and a severance package that would carry us through 6 comfortable months. We'd celebrated with cheap champagne and expensive sushi, and for the first time in years, she'd slept past 7. I told Gerald I'd pass along the message. He begged me not to hang up. I hung up anyway. That was the last normal act of my life. By the time I poured a fresh cup of coffee and turned on the kitchen television, the local news was already fracturing. The anchor, a woman named Patricia Yoon, who'd been a steady presence on Channel 9 for 2 decades, was reading from handwritten notes instead of the teleprompter. Her voice carried a frequency I'd never heard from her before. Not panic exactly, but the absence of the performance of calm. She was telling viewers to stay inside. She was telling them to lock their doors. The graphic behind her showed a map of the interstate system with red markers clustered along the I-44 corridor. And the crawl at the bottom of the screen read, CDC confirms novel pathogen behavioral alteration in advanced cases. Avoid contact with symptomatic individuals. I set my coffee down and didn't pick it up again. Our neighbor, Marcus Hale, was outside. I could see him through the kitchen window, standing on his front lawn in a bathrobe, holding his phone at arm's length like he was trying to get a signal from God. His wife Jeanette was in the doorway behind him, holding their youngest against her hip. Their oldest, a 12-year-old named Corinne, was on the porch with binoculars, scanning the street like she'd been training for this her whole life. I opened the back door and called across the fence. Marcus, you watching the news? He turned to me with eyes that had already moved past confusion into calculation. Marcus was former Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan, a man whose resting state was tactical assessment. Been watching since 4. My brother's a paramedic in Tulsa. He called me at 3:15 and told me to fill every container in the house with water and not to ask questions. Did you? Every bathtub, every pot. Bought out the water aisle at the Quick Trip on 7th before the sun came up. He paused. You should wake Dana. I didn't ask how he knew she was sleeping. Marcus knew everything about our street. He knew which houses had generators, which had guns, which had elderly residents who would need help. He had a map in his head that most of us didn't even know existed. Shocked, I went upstairs. Dana was curled on her side, breathing in that deep, untroubled way she'd only recently rediscovered. I sat on the edge of the bed and put my hand on her shoulder. "Something's happening," I said. She opened her eyes. She didn't ask what. She just looked at me, and she knew. By 9 o'clock, the street had changed. Not in any physical way, the houses were the same, the lawns still green from last week's rain, the mailboxes standing like sentries. But the atmosphere had shifted. Curtains that were usually open were drawn. Cars that usually left for work at 7 were still in driveways. And from somewhere east, maybe 3 or 4 miles away, there was a sound I couldn't identify. A low, rhythmic thudding, like someone beating a carpet, but continuous and growing. Dana came downstairs dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, her hair pulled back, her face set in the expression I'd come to recognize over 17 years of marriage as her operational mode. This was the woman who'd rebuilt Kessler Brandt's entire distribution model after the 2019 tornado season. She didn't waste movement or words when the stakes were real. "Tell me everything," she said. I told her about Gerald's call, about the news, about Marcus. She listened without interruption, then walked to the pantry and started taking inventory. We had approximately 3 weeks of food. If we were careful, she'd done a major Costco run the weekend after quitting, partly out of celebration, partly out of the nesting instinct that always followed a major life change. "Gerald said the GPS systems were wrong," I said. "What did he mean?" She paused with a can of chickpeas in her hand. "The routing software at Kessler Brandt ties into a proprietary satellite network that cross-references real-time traffic data with municipal emergency signals. If the emergency infrastructure starts overloading, the system can't distinguish between a road closure and a catastrophic event. It starts sending drivers into dead zones. And the 14 drivers they can't reach." She set the can down slowly. "If the system routed them into an area that's been locked down by emergency services, their comms would be blocked by the Federal Override Protocol. It's a post-9/11 feature. It means those areas are classified as active threat zones." The weight of that landed between us like a stone in still water. At 9:22, Marcus knocked on our front door. He'd changed out of his bathrobe and was now wearing cargo pants, boots, and a look that had shed every trace of suburban softness. With him was his wife Jeanette, their 2 children, and a woman I didn't recognize, mid-50s, silver hair cropped close, with the bearing of someone who'd spent a career giving orders. "This is Dr. Lena Osei," Marcus said. "She lives on Birchwood, 3 streets over. She's an epidemiologist, retired from the WHO 2 years ago." Dr. Osei stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. She shook my hand with a grip that meant business and locked eyes with me for exactly 1 second longer than was socially normal. "I've been monitoring pathogen reports from international colleagues for the last 6 hours. What the news is telling you is approximately 48 hours behind what is actually happening." Dana emerged from the pantry. "How far behind?" "The behavioral alterations they're describing as advanced stage symptoms. Those were documented in Wuhan province 11 days ago, in Marseille 9 days ago, in Sao Paulo 6 days ago. The pattern isn't spreading. It's already here. It's been here." Jeanette Hale sat down at our kitchen table without asking and began nursing the baby with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who'd learned to multitask under pressure. Corinne positioned herself at the living room window with her binoculars. Marcus stood by the front door like a centuries-old reflex had taken over. "The incubation period is between 12 and 36 hours, Dr. Osei continued. Transmission appears to be fluid-based blood, saliva, possibly sweat in high-concentration scenarios. The behavioral change is progressive. Agitation, then coordination loss, Then targeted aggression. The infected don't wander. They hunt. Dana absorbed this information the way she absorbed all critical data silently, completely, already building frameworks in her mind. What's the mortality rate for the infected? You misunderstand the pathology, Dr. Osei said. The infected don't die. The people they find do. Outside, the thudding sound from the east had gotten louder. Corinne lowered her binoculars and turned to us with a face that had aged 5 years in 5 seconds. There are people running on Garrison Avenue, she said. A lot of people. And something is behind them. I saw the first one through the gap in the living room curtains at 9:31 a.m. It had been a man once, you could tell by the remnants of a FedEx uniform still clinging to his frame. But whatever animating principle had governed his humanity was gone, replaced by something that moved with the terrible economy of a predator that didn't need to think. He crossed Marcus's lawn in 4 strides, stopped at the oak tree near the sidewalk, and stood motionless, his head cocked at an angle that no comfortable neck would choose. His eyes tracked the windows of the houses like a searchlight sweeping a prison yard. Behind him, Garrison Avenue had become a river of terror. People I recognized filled Dorsey from the hardware store. 2 of the Nguyen sisters who ran the bakery on 5th were sprinting west with the ragged, graceless desperation of prey animals who'd already been running too long. And behind them, spaced with unnatural precision, were more figures in that same wrong-jointed, purposeful gait. Dana pulled me back from the window. Don't let them see movement. Marcus was already moving through our house with fluid authority, checking door locks, testing window latches, pulling blinds. Jeanette had taken both children upstairs to the master bedroom, and I could hear her murmuring to them in the low, steady tone of a woman constructing normalcy from nothing. Dr. Osei watched the street through a crack in the kitchen blinds with clinical detachment. She was taking notes in a small leather journal. The coordination is more advanced than the Sao Paulo report suggested, she said. They're spacing themselves to cover maximum visual range. This isn't random aggression. There's a collective tactical logic. Pack hunting, Marcus said from the hallway. More sophisticated than that. Pack hunters communicate. These are operating on shared instinct without visible signaling. It suggests the pathogen affects not just behavior, but neural architecture, possibly creating a distributed processing network across infected individuals. I didn't fully understand what she was saying, but I understood the implication. These things were organized, and they were getting better at it. Dana had retreated to the dining room table with a legal pad and was sketching a map of our neighborhood from memory. Every house, every fence line, every alley and drainage ditch. She marked our position with a circle and began annotating surrounding properties. The Kowalskis have a generator and a ham radio set up. 2 houses down, the Brennans left for vacation last Thursday. Their house is empty, but they have a detached garage with exterior access. The church on Elm has a basement that was renovated as a storm shelter in 2022. Marcus leaned over her shoulder. You mapped all this from memory. Logistics is about knowing what's where and how to move it. The product doesn't matter: freight, people, resources. The principles are the same. I felt something shift in the room. The unspoken negotiation of leadership had just been settled, and it hadn't gone the way anyone expected. Marcus had the military training. Dr. Osei had the scientific knowledge. But Dana had the architecture, the ability to see systems, connections, vulnerabilities, and roots that the rest of us experienced only as geography. Gerald Fenton called again at 9:45. This time I answered not out of obligation, but out of strategic instinct. A man with access to a logistics network, even a collapsing one, Might have information we needed. 14 drivers are still dark, he said, and his voice had changed. The crying was gone. Something flatter and more frightening had replaced it. But 3 came back on comms 20 minutes ago. They're reporting that the interstate on-ramps are being physically blocked. Not by authorities, by the infected. They're funneling traffic into choke points. Dana took the phone from my hand. Gerald, this is Dana. I need you to pull up the satellite overlay for the regional grid and tell me which corridors are still showing green traffic flow. I heard Gerald's breathing change the relief of a drowning man seeing a rope. He began reading coordinates, and Dana began marking her map with green lines that represented the rapidly shrinking arteries through which escape was still possible. Outside, the man in the FedEx uniform had been joined by 3 others. They stood in a loose semicircle facing our block, patient as stones. By noon, our house had become a command center that none of us had planned and all of us needed. 8 people were now inside our original group plus 2 additions who'd arrived in the strange, desperate calculus of the first hours. Tommy Whitfield, a 23-year-old apprentice electrician who'd been working on the Brennan house's wiring when everything started, had climbed our back fence with a tool belt and a face drained of color. He'd seen the infected take someone on Garrison Avenue. He wouldn't say who, he wouldn't say how. He just kept touching his tool belt like a rosary. The other arrival was Mrs. Adaora Ibi, 71 years old, who lived alone in the blue house on the corner and had been pounding quietly on our back door while clutching a canvas bag filled with prescription medications and a framed photograph of a man I assumed was her late husband. She hadn't spoken since arriving, but she'd stationed herself in the kitchen and begun organizing our food supplies with the systematic precision of someone who'd survived scarcity before. Dana's map had grown. She'd taped additional sheets of legal paper around the original, extending the coverage to a 12-block radius. Green corridors had become yellow and then red as Gerald's satellite data showed the infection's footprint expanding in real time. She was on the phone with him constantly now. Their relationship transformed from the wreckage of corporate politics into something forged by necessity. The southern corridor through Route 9 is still open, Gerald reported at 12:15. But the flow rate is dropping. 15 minutes ago, it was showing normal vehicle density. Now it's spiking. Everyone's trying to get through at once. That corridor leads to the bridge at Millhaven, Donna said. If it's bottlenecking, the infected will find it. They're drawn to density. Dr. Osei confirmed this from the kitchen, where she'd set up a makeshift research station using her phone's hotspot and a laptop Tommy had retrieved from the Brennan house. Sao Paulo data showed the infected consistently migrating toward population concentrations. Noise, movement, thermal signatures, any combination can attract them. A traffic jam would be catastrophic. Marcus had taken a different approach to the crisis, while Dana mapped and Dr. Osei researched. He'd conducted a silent security audit of our property. The results weren't encouraging. Our house was a standard suburban construction vinyl siding. Double-pane windows, hollow core interior doors, a single deadbolt on front and back entries. This house isn't a fortress, he said quietly to me in the hallway. It's a suggestion. What do we need? Ideally, reinforced entry points, secondary exit routes, line-of-sight barriers on all ground-floor windows, and a fallback position on the second floor with independent access to the roof. He paused. Realistically, we need to board the windows and pray they don't push hard. Tommy, who'd been sitting on the stairs in a fog of shock, suddenly stood up. I can reinforce the doors. The Brennan garage has lumber. They were planning a deck build. Framing lumber, lag screws, a circular saw with a battery pack. I can brace every entry point in this house in 3 hours. It was the first useful thing he'd said since arriving. And I watched the words pull him back from whatever edge he'd been approaching. Purpose was a lifeline. I'd learn that lesson again and again in the days ahead. Marcus studied Tommy for a moment, then nodded. I'll go with you. We move fast, stay low, and we don't stop for anything we see. I'll go too, I said. Dana looked up from her map. Our eyes met, and 17 years of marriage compressed into a single exchange. She didn't want me to go. She understood why I had to. She communicated both truths simultaneously without a word. Marcus, Tommy, and I went out through the back door at 12:40. The yard was quiet. The summer air was warm and smelled of cut grass and something else. Something faintly chemical, like ozone before a lightning strike. We crossed to the fence line in a low crouch. Marcus went first, Tommy second. I paused at the fence and looked back at the house. Dana was watching from the upstairs window. She raised one hand, flat, steady. That image would sustain me through what came next. The Brennan garage was 40 yards away across 2 properties. But those 40 yards contained more fear than I'd experienced in my entire previous life combined. We moved along the fence line, using hedgerows and a rusted garden shed as cover. Marcus navigated with hand signals I half remembered from action movies, but somehow understood instinctively: stop, move, down, look. The FedEx driver and his companions had moved. They were no longer on our block. Marcus had spotted them drifting north toward Garrison Avenue, where the sounds of running and screaming had diminished into an intermittent, terrible quiet. Their absence should have been comforting. It wasn't. It meant they were hunting somewhere we couldn't see, and their return was a matter of when, not if. The Brennan property was immaculate in that way of people who've just left on vacation lawn, freshly mowed, garden hoses coiled, a sprinkler still attached to the faucet, and ready for a watering schedule that would never resume. The detached garage was locked with a combination padlock, but Tommy produced a set of bolt cutters from his tool belt with a sheepish expression. Standard equipment, he muttered, for when clients lose their keys. Inside, the garage was a treasure vault of suburban preparedness. The Brennans had been serious about their deck project. Stacked against the west wall were 32 8-foot pressure-treated 4x4s, a dozen sheets of plywood, boxes of structural screws, and a DeWalt circular saw with 3 fully charged batteries. There were also things the Brennans probably hadn't considered survival resources. A 5-gallon fuel can, a first aid kit mounted on the wall, a case of bottled water, and a pair of heavy-duty work lights with rechargeable batteries. We loaded what we could carry. Marcus took the plywood 2 sheets balanced on his shoulders with the ease of a man whose body had never fully left the military. Tommy shouldered the tool bag and the saw. I carried the lumber in bundles, making 3 trips along the fence line, while Marcus maintained a perimeter watch from the Brennan's back corner. On my second trip, I heard it, a sound from inside the Brennan house. A single thump against an interior wall, followed by a scraping noise that tracked horizontally, like something dragging itself from room to room. The Brennan's back door was closed. The curtains were drawn, but through a gap in the kitchen window covering, I saw movement, a shadow that didn't behave the way shadows should, jerking in starts and stops with a mechanical wrongness that Dr. Osei's description had prepared me for. Someone was inside that house, someone who hadn't left for vacation, a house sitter, a relative checking on the property, someone who'd been infected and had found their way inside, and who was now pacing the interior in the restless, predatory patrol that marked the late-stage behavioral shift. I froze. The lumber on my shoulders suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. Marcus materialized beside me with soundless precision and followed my gaze. He saw the shadow. His hand went to my arm, not to comfort, but to communicate. We moved. Slowly. Away from the house, along the fence. Back toward our property with the controlled urgency of people who understood that speed and noise were equally fatal. Tommy was already inside our fence line, unpacking tools with the focused intensity of someone who'd found salvation in labor. We handed the remaining supplies over the fence and climbed after them. And only when I was standing on my own lawn did I let myself breathe. The Brennan house is compromised, Marcus told Dana when we got inside. At least one infected, possibly more. Dana marked the Brennan house on her map with a red X. It was the first red mark on our immediate block. It wouldn't be the last. Tommy began reinforcing the front door with plywood and lag screws, the circular saw screaming briefly before Marcus stopped him. Hand tools only. No powered noise. Tommy switched to a manual screwdriver without argument, and the slow, deliberate sound of screws biting into wood became the soundtrack of our transformation from a house of neighbors into a fortification of survivors. Mrs. Ibe brought Tommy a glass of water without being asked. He took it with shaking hands and thanked her in a voice that cracked on the second word. By 4 o'clock, the house was as secure as suburban materials and desperate ingenuity could make it. Tommy had braced every exterior door with crossed 4x4s anchored to the floor joists. The ground floor windows were covered with plywood, screwed into the framing, not the trim, Tommy insisted, the actual structural framing. He'd cut narrow observation slits at eye level in strategic windows that Marcus designated as watch points. The back door was reinforced but left accessible as an emergency exit, with a quick release bar that could be lifted from inside. The internet died at 3:17 p.m. One moment, Dr. Osei was pulling epidemiological data from a WHO colleague in Geneva. The next, the connection dropped to nothing and didn't return. Cell service followed 20 minutes later, not a gradual degradation, but a hard cutoff, as though someone had thrown a switch. Gerald's last communication to Dana before the lines went dead was a set of coordinates marking the final open corridor south. "That's the bridge at Millhaven," Dana said, staring at the numbers on her phone's screen as though they might rearrange themselves into better news. 14 miles from here. "Through how much infected territory?" Marcus asked. Dana consulted her map. The red marks had proliferated during the afternoon, as we'd heard sounds, screams, crashes, the occasional gunshot from surrounding blocks. At minimum, 6 blocks of confirmed or probable infected presence, plus whatever's developed along the route that we can't observe from here. The conversation that followed was the first of many that would divide our group along philosophical lines that none of us had known we possessed. Marcus argued for movement, a nighttime push toward the bridge before the corridor closed permanently. Dr. Osei argued for sheltering in place, citing the tactical disadvantage of moving a group that included a 71-year-old woman, 2 children, and an infant through active hunting grounds. Dana listened to both perspectives and then offered a third option that reframed the debate entirely. "We don't choose between staying and going," she said. "We prepare for both simultaneously. We fortify this position as our base while scouting the route to Millhaven. If the scout confirms the corridor is viable, we move the full group. If not, we're already secure here." "Who scouts?" Marcus asked, though we all knew the answer. "You and me," Donna said. "Tonight." I opened my mouth to object, and she stopped me with a look that carried the full weight of our history. "You stay with the group. You're the only one besides Marcus they'll follow. And Marcus will be with me." This was the moment I understood that my wife hadn't just been a logistics director. She'd been a leader operating in a system that refused to recognize her as one. Now, with the system gone, the recognition was irrelevant. The competence was everything. At 6 p.m., the power went out. Not a flicker, not a brownout, a complete cessation of electrical service that plunged the neighborhood into an early twilight. Tommy connected the work lights to their batteries and positioned them in the interior hallway where the glow wouldn't leak through the observation slits. Mrs. Iba began preparing a meal from canned goods, with the quiet authority of someone who'd cooked without electricity before. Jeanette put the children to bed in the upstairs guest room, creating a nest of blankets and pillows that approximated safety. Dr. Osei called us together in the living room at 7. She had information she'd been processing since the internet died, and her face carried the particular gravity of someone about to change the parameters of everyone's fear. Before the connection dropped, my colleague in Geneva sent a final data packet. The pathogen has a secondary transmission vector that the public reports haven't addressed. She paused, choosing words with surgical care. Aerosolized transmission is possible in enclosed, high-density environments, not casual exposure, prolonged proximity in unventilated spaces. The silence that followed was the sound of every person in the room doing the same math. We were 10 people in a boarded-up house with no ventilation. How prolonged? Dana asked. The Geneva data suggests sustained exposure of 4 to 6 hours in an enclosed space with an infected individual. Every eye in the room turned involuntarily toward the walls, toward the Brennan house next door, toward the question none of us wanted to ask. Who among us had already been exposed, and how would we know before it was too late? Marcus and Dana left at 11 p.m. through the back door, dressed in dark clothing, carrying a hand-drawn map, 2 flashlights with red filters, and a kitchen knife each. I stood at the door and watched them disappear into the darkness of our backyard, moving low and fast toward the eastern fence line. Marcus had plotted a route that avoided Garrison Avenue entirely, threading through residential backyards and a drainage easement that ran behind the commercial strip on Oak Street. The route to Millhaven Bridge would take them through approximately 4 miles of territory that we had zero intelligence on. I locked the door behind them and stood in the darkened kitchen for a long moment, listening. The neighborhood at night had a new vocabulary. The usual suburban symphony air conditioners, distant traffic, the occasional dog had been replaced by a language of absence and intrusion. Wind through trees that now sounded like breathing, the creak of unsettled houses that now sounded like footsteps. And beneath it all, irregularly spaced, a sound like someone rhythmically striking a wooden fence post 3 or 4 blocks away. Tommy was on first watch at the living room observation slit. He'd fashioned a periscope from a compact mirror and a piece of PVC pipe, allowing him to scan the street without pressing his face against the plywood. Resourceful and anxious, a combination that made him either the most useful or the most dangerous member of our group, depending on which quality dominated at any given moment. I sat with Dr. Osei in the dining room, where she'd spread her handwritten notes across Dana's expanded map. The candlelight turned her face into a landscape of sharp shadows and measured concern. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me," I said. "I have been nothing else." The aerosolized transmission. When Marcus and Tommy were at the Brennan garage, I was within 20 feet of their back door for at least 8 minutes. There's an infected person inside, maybe more than one. She studied me with the unblinking assessment of someone trained to diagnose populations. "Were you outdoors?" "Yes." "Wind?" "Light, southeast." The Brennan door was closed, windows intact. "As far as I could see." She considered this. Outdoor exposure with physical barriers between you and the source, with any air movement at all, would not constitute the sustained, enclosed proximity the data describes. I believe your risk is negligible. You believe? In the absence of controlled studies, which this pathogen has outpaced, belief calibrated by available evidence is the best I can offer anyone. I appreciated her honesty more than I would have appreciated false comfort. Dr. Osei had a quality I'd come to recognize as essential in crisis. She treated uncertainty as information rather than weakness. Upstairs, I heard Corinne Hale talking to her mother in low, serious tones. That 12-year-old had spent the entire day observing, cataloging, and reporting without a single complaint or emotional outburst. She'd identified the movement patterns of infected individuals on our street, noting that they tended to cluster near intersections and move in a counterclockwise patrol pattern that she'd mapped on the back of a cereal box. Marcus had looked at her map with an expression I couldn't fully read, pride layered over grief, layered over the terrible understanding that his daughter was adapting to a world that shouldn't require adaptation from a child. Mrs. Eby appeared at my elbow with a cup of tea made from dried mint she'd found in Donna's pantry. She sat down beside me and spoke for the first time since arriving. In 1967, during the Civil War in Biafra, my mother walked 47 miles carrying me on her back. I was 3 years old. She had no map, no weapons, no information about what was ahead. She had only the knowledge that staying was death and moving was possibility. She sipped her tea with steady hands. Your wife understands this. That is why she went. The old woman's words settled into me like stones dropped into deep water, displacing something stagnant and replacing it with a clarity I desperately needed. I finished my tea, checked every door and window, and took my position at the upstairs watch point facing east, waiting for Dana to come back from the dark. They returned at 3:47 a.m. I heard the coded knock, 3 quick, 2 slow, and opened the back door to find Marcus supporting Dana, who was limping badly on her left ankle. They came inside trailing the smell of wet earth and adrenaline, and I locked the door behind them with hands that trembled more than I wanted anyone to see. She twisted it on the drainage culvert, Marcus said before I could ask. Nothing broken. We wrapped it in the field. Dana was pale but focused, her eyes carrying the particular luminescence of someone who'd seen things that would take days to process. She sat at the dining table and immediately began annotating her map, adding detail to areas that had previously been blank. The corridor to Millhaven is closed, she said. The bridge is gone. The word landed like a physical blow. Gone how? Military. There's a National Guard presence on the far side. They demolished the bridge span at approximately 1 a.m. We heard the detonation from 2 miles out. They're establishing a containment perimeter. Everything on this side of the river is being written off. Dr. Osei absorbed this without visible reaction. Marcus sat down heavily and pulled off his boots, revealing blisters that told the story of 4 miles of rough terrain at speed. Jeanette appeared on the stairs, read her husband's face, and descended to tend to his feet without a word. There's more, Dana continued. The commercial district on Oak Street is overrun. Minimum 30 to 40 infected concentrated around the grocery store and the gas station. They've established what Marcus calls a territory, a defined area they defend and patrol. They don't wander randomly. They hold ground. Territorial behavior with collective defense, Dr. Osei said, writing rapidly. That's a significant behavioral evolution from the earlier reports. Sao Paulo described disorganized aggression. This is structured occupation. It gets worse, Marcus said quietly. We observed something near the Oak Street overpass. A group of infected, maybe 15, were moving in formation. Not pack hunting, marching. They had a direction and a pace, and they maintained spacing like a patrol unit. He looked at Dr. Osei. These things are learning. The implications unfolded in the room like poisoned smoke. If the infected were developing organized behavior, territorial control, and tactical movement, then our boarded windows and braced doors weren't a defense. They were a delay. Tommy, who'd been listening from the hallway, spoke up. So we can't go south. What about north, west? Dana shook her head. We could see fires to the north from the Oak Street overpass, entire blocks burning. The fire department isn't responding. Either they can't or they've been overrun. West takes us deeper into residential density, which means more infected and less open ground. East? I asked. Dana and Marcus exchanged a look that contained a conversation I wasn't part of. East is complicated, Dana said carefully. There's a route through the industrial park behind the rail yards that showed minimal infected activity when we passed it, but it leads to the Kessler-Brandt distribution center. I understood immediately. Gerald and whatever's left of his operation. The distribution center is a steel-framed commercial building with reinforced loading docks, generator backup, and a communication array that operates on a dedicated satellite frequency independent of cellular infrastructure. She paused. If any facility in this area is still functional, it's that one. You want to go to the building you just quit, I said. I want to go to the building I know better than anyone alive. I know every door code, every maintenance tunnel, every blind spot in the security system. I know where the emergency supplies are stored and how to activate the backup communications. I spent 11 years making that building run. Her jaw tightened. I didn't quit the building. I quit the man who was destroying it. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The job she'd walked away from in principled defiance was now the only destination that offered structural safety and communication capability. Gerald's tearful phone call hadn't been just desperation. It had been prophecy. Dana looked around the room at every face. We move tomorrow night, all of us, east. The day between the decision and the departure was the longest of my life. 20 hours of preparation compressed into a space between boarded walls where 9 people negotiated their survival with varying degrees of cooperation, fear, and barely suppressed conflict. The first fracture appeared over Mrs. Iba. She was 71. She walked with a slight hitch from a replaced hip. The journey to the Kessler-Brandt facility was approximately 3 miles through uncertain terrain. And Dana's ankle, now wrapped in an ACE bandage from Tommy's first aid supplies, was a visible reminder that even able-bodied members of our group could be compromised by the landscape. Tommy raised the concern with the diplomatic subtlety of a man half his age should have outgrown. I'm just saying, if we have to run, she can't. And if she can't, we all stop. And if we all stop... Finish that sentence. Mrs. Ibe's voice came from the kitchen doorway, with a force that silenced the room. She stood with her shoulders squared and her eyes burning with a dignity that made Tommy physically retreat. Finish it. Tell me what happens when I slow you down. Say the words you're thinking, young man, so that everyone in this room can hear what kind of person you become when you're afraid. Tommy looked at the floor. I didn't mean. You meant exactly what you said. You are calculating my value and finding it insufficient. I have been calculated before. By men in uniforms. By men in suits. By men who thought that being young and strong entitled them to decide who was worth saving. She paused. I will walk every step of that 3 miles. I will not slow you down. And if I do, you will not be the one who decides what happens next. The exchange reshaped the group's internal dynamics more than any tactical briefing could have. Tommy retreated to his reinforcement work with a shame that I hoped would mature into something useful. Mrs. Ebay returned to the kitchen with her authority enhanced. And the rest of us understood, without it being spoken, that our survival was not negotiable on an individual basis. We moved together, or we didn't move at all. The second fracture was quieter and more dangerous. Dr. Osei pulled me aside at midday and told me, in a voice calibrated to reach my ears only, that she was concerned about Marcus. He's been checking the front door locks every 18 minutes. The interval is exact. I've been timing it. And he's positioned himself so that he always has a direct sight line to both exits. These are patterns consistent with hypervigilance progressing toward a dissociative state. He's a combat veteran in a combat situation, I said. Isn't that just training? Training and trauma share the same behavioral vocabulary. The difference is in the flexibility of response. When I spoke to him this morning about an adjustment to the watch schedule, he responded with disproportionate rigidity. He's operating in a threat matrix that has very little room for deviation. And as our situation becomes more complex, that rigidity could become a liability. I watched Marcus from across the room. He was examining a window brace with the meticulous attention of a man who trusted materials more than people. Jeanette hovered nearby, not interfering, but present, in the way of a partner who'd learned to be close without crowding. "What do I do with this information?" I asked. "You hold it. You watch. And if a moment comes where his response is escalating beyond what the situation requires, you step in before Dana has to. She's the strategic authority. You're the emotional infrastructure. Those are different jobs, and both are essential." I hadn't thought of myself that way. But Dr. Osei's framing was precise. Dana built the plan. I held the people. Between us, we formed a structure that neither could sustain alone. At 4 o'clock, Corinne reported that the infected on our street had increased from 3 to 7. They'd taken up positions at the intersection of our block and Garrison Avenue, standing in their eerie, motionless surveillance posture. We were being watched. Not randomly, not incidentally. They knew we were here. We left at midnight. 10 people moving single file through my backyard and into the alley behind our property, guided by Dana's map and Marcus's instincts and the absolute imperative of silence. The order had been debated for an hour. Marcus on point. Then Tommy carrying the larger of the Hale children 8-year-old Devon, who'd been given a mild antihistamine from Mrs. Ibe's medication bag to ensure he slept through the transit. Jeanette followed with the baby strapped to her chest in a carrier reinforced with dish towels to muffle any sound. Corinne walked behind her mother with the binoculars around her neck and a maturity that broke my heart every time I looked at it. Dr. Osei came next, then Mrs. Ibe, then me, then Dana at the rear, limping but resolute, her eyes scanning behind us. The first 3 blocks were ghostly in their normalcy. Houses dark, cars parked, lawns tidy. If you didn't know, you might think the power outage was temporary, the silence seasonal. But the details betrayed the truth, a front door hanging open on one house. A child's bicycle overturned in a driveway with one wheel still slowly spinning from a breeze. A dark stain on a sidewalk that reflected moonlight in a way that concrete shouldn't. Marcus navigated using landmarks Dana had identified on the map, a distinctive wrought iron fence, a water tower visible above the roof line, the steeple of the church on Elm. We avoided open intersections by cutting through yards and climbing fences. Tommy lifted Mrs. Ibe over each fence with a gentleness that served as his ongoing apology. She accepted his help without acknowledgement, which was its own form of grace. The industrial park began at the edge of the commercial district, and here the landscape shifted from residential denial to industrial collapse. The first building we passed was a plumbing supply warehouse with its loading dock doors peeled open like aluminum petals. Inside, I could see overturned shelving and scattered inventory copper fittings and PVC joints scattered across the floor like the aftermath of an earthquake. But there were no bodies. No infected, just emptiness and disorder. Marcus signaled a halt at the corner of the warehouse. He crouched and listened with an intensity that seemed to engage his entire nervous system. After 30 seconds, he pointed to the rail yard, ahead a wide-open expanse of gravel and steel tracks that offered no cover but the most direct route to the Kessler-Brandt facility, visible now as a dark geometric mass against the slightly lighter sky. "Open ground," he whispered to Donna. 400 meters. No cover. Alternative. Around the rail yard adds a mile and takes us past the fuel depot. If any infected are drawn to petroleum fumes, we cross, fast. The rail yard crossing was 3 minutes of exposed terror. We moved in a tight group, abandoning the single-file formation for a cluster that could respond as a unit if something emerged from the darkness. The gravel crunched under our feet with a volume that felt catastrophic in the silence. Devin slept against Tommy's shoulder. The baby remained miraculously quiet. Mrs. Ibe moved with a determination that defied every concern Tommy had raised. Her steps quick and certain on the uneven ground. Halfway across, Corinne tugged her mother's sleeve and pointed north. Along the tree line at the rail yard's perimeter, approximately 200 meters away, a line of figures stood motionless. 7, maybe 8. Their silhouettes were wrong in the way I'd come to recognize heads tilted, posture asymmetric, the suggestion of joints bending at angles that evolution hadn't intended. They were watching us. "Don't stop," Marcus breathed. "Maintain pace. Don't look at them." Every instinct screamed to run. Every rational thought insisted on the discipline of controlled movement. We walked. The figures didn't follow. They observed with the patient calculation that Dr. Osei had described not disorganized predators, but distributed intelligence evaluating a target, running some terrible internal calculus about whether to engage. We reached the far side of the rail yard, and the shadow of the Kessler-Brandt building swallowed us like a benediction. Behind us, the figures remained at the tree line. They'd let us pass. The question of why they'd let us pass would haunt me far longer than any nightmare. The Kessler-Brandt Distribution Center was a cathedral of commerce. Rendered in corrugated steel and reinforced concrete, Dana led us to a service entrance on the building's east face, a heavy steel door with a keypad lock that she punched without hesitation. The code still worked. Either Gerald hadn't changed it, or the system was running on backup protocols that defaulted to long-standing access credentials. Inside, the air was cool and carried the industrial perfume of cardboard, diesel residue, and institutional cleaning solution. Emergency lighting cast the corridor in a low amber glow. The generators were running, fed by the facility's underground diesel reserves that Dana said could sustain basic power for 3 weeks. The distribution floor stretched beyond the corridor like an airplane hangar, rows of shelving reaching toward a ceiling 40 feet above, stacked with pallets of goods that represented the arterial supply chain of 30 counties. Gerald Fenton met us at the junction of the main corridor and the operations wing. He looked like a man who'd been living in his office for a week, which, as it turned out, was precisely the case. His shirt was wrinkled into geological strata. His eyes were red-rimmed but sharp. When he saw Dana, his expression underwent a transformation that compressed relief, shame, gratitude, and desperation into a single facial contortion. "Thank God," he said. "Thank God." "How many people are here?" Dana asked, bypassing reunion for reconnaissance. 17. 12 warehouse staff who were on shift when the lockdown started. 3 drivers who made it back, me, and Helen Chen from IT, who's been keeping the satellite comms running on prayer and duct tape. Dana was already moving, assessing the facility with the proprietary knowledge of someone who'd spent a decade optimizing its every function. She checked the loading dock seals, reinforced steel rated for Category 5 winds, locked and bolted from inside. She verified the generator status, running at 40% capacity on economy mode. She located the emergency supply cache she'd personally advocated for during the 2022 budget cycle, a locked room containing water purification tablets, first aid supplies, thermal blankets, and 2 weeks of freeze-dried rations for 20 people. Gerald followed her like a lost satellite returning to orbit. The new VP Henderson, he gutted the emergency protocols the week after you left, removed the secondary generator, canceled the shelter-in-place training, said it was unnecessary overhead. "Where is Henderson now?" Dana asked. Gerald's face went through something complicated. He left on the second day, said he was going to the National Guard rally point, took one of the company vehicles and drove south. "The bridge at Millhaven was demolished 2 nights ago," Dana said. "Southbound traffic has been funneling into military containment zones." Gerald processed this. The implications settled across his features like a slow tide. Henderson was gone. In which direction, the living or the dead, was unknowable, and, in the calculus of the moment, irrelevant. Our group merged with Gerald's existing survivors in the facility's break room, a generous space with industrial tables, a commercial kitchen, and windows that had been covered with shipping plastic and packing tape. The Kessler-Brandt employees regarded us with the cautious hope of people who'd been waiting for someone to arrive and tell them what to do. Helen Chen, a compact woman in her 40s, with a headset perpetually tangled in her hair, briefed us on communications. The satellite array was functional and had been intermittently connecting to a network of similar commercial installations across the region. Information was fragmented and contradictory, but certain facts had emerged. The military containment perimeter extended along the river for approximately 40 miles in each direction. Evacuation corridors were being established for uninfected populations, but required reaching designated extraction points beyond the containment line. "The nearest extraction point is at the Grayfield airstrip, 12 miles northeast," Helen said. "Military helicopters are running daily extractions between 0600 and 0800. 12 miles. Through territory we had no intelligence on, with a group that now numbered 27 people, including children, an infant, and an elderly woman with a replaced hip." Dana looked at her map, then at me, then at the room full of faces depending on her. "We have 3 days of generator fuel if we stay," she said. "We have 1 chance if we go." The debate that followed was the most consequential democratic exercise any of us would ever participate in. 27 people in a break room, deciding between the known diminishment of staying and the unknown peril of moving. Dana laid out both scenarios with the impartiality of an analyst, though I could read which direction her mind inclined. Staying meant 3 days of power, followed by darkness. It meant dwindling food. Our combined supplies could sustain 27 people for approximately 10 days, if rationed severely. It meant the slow psychological deterioration of confinement with no rescue timeline, and the growing certainty that the infected were establishing permanent territorial control over the surrounding area. Going meant 12 miles of night travel through uncharted conditions. It meant risking 27 lives, including 5 children, on the accuracy of fragmented satellite intelligence and the assumption that a military extraction point would still be operational when we arrived. It meant leaving behind a steel-walled fortress for the vulnerability of open movement. Marcus spoke first. In my experience, static positions in hostile territory are traps. You stay long enough, the enemy maps you. They probe your defenses. They find the weakness. We stay here, and every day that passes, they learn more about us than we learn about them. Gerald countered with surprising force. This building was designed to withstand severe weather events and maintain operational continuity during regional emergencies. The walls are 12-inch reinforced concrete on the ground floor. The loading docks are rated for vehicular impact. We're safer here than anywhere within 50 miles. We're safer here today, Dr. Osei said. The question is whether that's true next week. The pathogen is driving behavioral evolution at a rate inconsistent with any known biological model. The infected I observed tonight were exhibiting tactical patience. They watched us cross the rail yard and chose not to engage. That's not the behavior of mindless predators. That's reconnaissance. Her words landed with the clinical devastation she intended. The room fell silent as people absorbed the implication that the things outside weren't just dangerous, they were learning to be more dangerous. Tommy, who'd been quiet since Mrs. Iba's reprimand, raised his hand like a schoolboy. What about the vehicles? This is a distribution center. There must be trucks. Gerald shook his head. The loading bay has 4 box trucks and a flatbed, but the facility access road connects to Route 7, which is blocked by a jackknife tanker about a quarter-mile out. We'd have to clear or bypass it. Dana had been studying her map during the discussion, adding information gleaned from Helen's satellite data. When she looked up, her face carried the expression I knew best, the one that meant she'd found the pattern no one else could see. We don't take Route 7. We take the utility access road that runs behind the rail yard to the water treatment plant on Lakeshore Drive. From there, County Road 12 runs northeast through agricultural land, low population density, minimal structures, open sight lines. 12 miles to Grayfield in a box truck at moderate speed is 18 minutes. And the infected along the route? Marcus asked. Agricultural land means low pre-outbreak population. Low population means low infection density. It's not guaranteed safe. Nothing is. But the probability curve favors open farmland over urban terrain by a significant margin. Helen looked up from her satellite terminal. I'm pulling thermal imaging from a commercial weather satellite that's still transmitting. The agricultural corridor on County Road 12 shows minimal heat signatures compared to the urban zones. She's right, it's the thinnest part of the infected territory. The vote wasn't formal. It didn't need to be. Dana's plan had the structural clarity that made alternatives feel like wishes. People began preparing with the focused energy of a group that had chosen their risk and was committed to owning it. Marcus organized the 27 into a departure manifest, assigning seats in 2 box trucks and the flatbed. Dana and Helen worked on timing departure at 4 a.m. to arrive at Grayfield during the extraction window. Gerald began transferring essential supplies from the emergency cache to the vehicles. I found Dana alone in her former office at 2 a.m., standing in front of a whiteboard covered in her handwriting from months earlier distribution routes, efficiency metrics, the architecture of a normal world. Different kind of logistics now, I said. She touched the whiteboard. Same principles. Move the right things to the right place at the right time. Keep people safe. Her voice caught on the last word, the first crack in her composure since this began. We departed at 4:12 a.m., 12 minutes behind schedule because the flatbed's battery was dead, and Tommy had to jump-start it from one of the box trucks. The delay felt catastrophic in the way that small problems become enormous when the margin for error is measured in minutes and lives. Marcus drove the lead truck with Dana navigating. I drove the second box truck with Gerald in the passenger seat and 14 people in the cargo bay, a mix of Kessler Brandt employees and our original neighborhood group. Mrs. Eba sat on an upturned crate near the cab wall, her bag of medications between her feet, the photograph of her husband in her hands. Dr. Osei sat beside her, still writing in her leather journal by the thin light of a penlight held in her teeth. Tommy drove the flatbed at the rear, carrying supplies and the 3 remaining Kessler Brandt warehouse workers who'd volunteered for the most exposed position. The utility access road was narrow and unpaved, flanked by drainage ditches and the skeletal infrastructure of electrical substations. Our headlights dimmed to parking lights only on Dana's orders, carved shallow cones of amber through the darkness. The box truck's engine seemed impossibly loud, a mechanical announcement of our presence that I felt in my teeth. We reached the water treatment plant without incident. The facility was dark and still, its settling pools reflecting a sky that was just beginning to lighten at the eastern horizon. Dana directed us onto County Road 12, and the landscape opened into the agricultural expanse she'd predicted. Flat fields of soybeans and corn stretching to the vanishing point. Farmhouses sparse and distant, the road straight and empty. For the first 5 miles, I allowed myself the dangerous luxury of hope. The road was clear. The fields were quiet. The sky was lightening into the gray-blue prelude of dawn. And the mathematical simplicity of distance divided by speed was counting down in our favor. At mile 6, the flatbed's horn sounded twice Tommy's signal for trouble. I checked the side mirror and saw the flatbed slowing, its brake lights flaring. Behind it, on the road we'd already traveled, headlights were approaching. Not vehicle headlights. These were too low, too numerous, and they moved with an irregular, weaving pattern that suggested they weren't headlights at all. Marcus's voice came through the walkie-talkie that Helen had distributed from the facility's supply room. Reflective eyes. Large group. Moving toward us on the road. Estimate 200 meters behind the flatbed and closing. 200 meters. A mob of infected on an open road, and our slowest vehicle was between them and us. "Tommy, accelerate to maximum safe speed," Dana ordered through the radio. "Do not stop for any reason." Tommy's response was immediate. The flatbed surged forward, its engine howling as it closed the gap between us. In the mirror, the constellation of reflected eyes grew larger, and I could begin to distinguish individual shapes, running figures, dozens of them, pouring from the fields on either side of the road as though the land itself was disgorging them. The agricultural corridor hadn't been empty. They'd been in the fields, in the corn, waiting or dormant or engaged in whatever process occupied the infected during the hours they weren't hunting. Our engines had woken them, and they were converging on the road behind us with a coordination that confirmed every terrible theory Dr. Osei had proposed. 6 miles to Grayfield, Dana said, her voice steady as forged steel. 12 minutes at current speed. The next 12 minutes were a sustained exercise in controlled terror. I drove with my hands locked on the wheel and my eyes alternating between the road ahead and the mirror behind. The flatbed maintained its position 50 yards back. Tommy driving with the grim precision of a man who understood that the 3 people in his cargo bed were depending on his ability to keep a straight line at maximum speed on a rural road in pre-dawn darkness. The infected couldn't match our speed. They fell behind incrementally, their running forms shrinking in the mirror until they were indistinguishable from the darkness they'd emerged from. But they didn't stop. They kept coming. A tide of corrupted human purpose flowing along the road in our wake. Grayfield Airstrip materialized out of the agricultural landscape, like an answer to a prayer I hadn't known I was making. A chain-link fence topped with concertina wire. Concrete barriers arranged in a serpentine approach pattern. Military vehicles, actual real olive drab vehicles with uniformed personnel standing beside them, positioned at a gate that was manned and lit and functioning. Dana was already on the radio. Grayfield Extraction Point. This is a civilian convoy of 27 souls approaching from the southwest on County Road 12. We have children, an infant, elderly, and injured, requesting immediate access. The response came in crisp military cadence. Civilian convoy, approach Gate Alpha at walking speed. All vehicle occupants must exit with hands visible. Medical screening will be conducted prior to entry. Weapons will be confiscated. Marcus brought the lead truck to a stop 30 yards from the gate. We followed. The flatbed pulled in behind us, and Tommy killed the engine with a finality that suggested he never wanted to drive anything again. I stepped out of the cab on legs that had forgotten how to work without a gas pedal and stood in the cool dawn air, breathing the smell of jet fuel and damp earth and the faint, institutional scent of military operations. The screening was efficient and impersonal. Soldiers in full protective equipment directed us into a processing area where medical personnel examined each person for signs of infection, bite marks, scratches, pupil dilation, coordination tests. They asked questions with the practiced detachment of people who'd been doing this for days and had learned to suppress their reactions to the answers. When did you last encounter infected? How close? Any physical contact? Any bites, scratches, or fluid exposure? Our group passed, every single one of us. Mrs. Iba submitted to the medical examination with the patience of a woman who'd been examined by strangers before and had outlasted every one of them. Devon Hale woke up during the screening and cried a normal, healthy, beautiful cry that made 3 soldiers look away. And one of them, a young woman who couldn't have been older than 22, press her hand against her own mouth. The extraction helicopters began arriving at 6 a.m. Blackhawks descending from the eastern sky in pairs, their rotors beating the air into submission. They loaded us in groups of 12, and the mathematical logistics of helicopter evacuation were so familiar to Dana's professional instincts that she found herself unconsciously calculating load distributions and fuel requirements. Our group was split across 2 helicopters. I rode with Dana, Marcus, Jeanette, the baby, and 6 Kessler Brandt employees. Mrs. Ibe rode in the second aircraft with Dr. Osi, Tommy, Gerald, Corinne, Devon, and the remaining survivors. As the helicopter lifted off, I looked down at the airstrip and saw more civilian vehicles arriving from different directions, each one a separate story of terror and determination and impossible luck. Then, I looked beyond the airstrip, south and west, toward the territory we'd crossed. From altitude, the scope of the catastrophe was visible in a way that ground-level survival had made impossible. Smoke columns from burning neighborhoods, the dark expanse of the abandoned city, and on the roads, in the fields, in the spaces between structures, movement not random, not chaotic, but patterned and purposeful. A civilization of the infected was establishing itself in the ruins of ours. Dana's hand found mine. Her grip was strong and certain, and carried in its pressure every decision she'd made in the past week: the quit, the map, the route, the refusal to leave anyone behind. Gerald sat across from us, staring at his shoes, holding in his lap a flash drive containing the only surviving backup of Kessler Brandt's distribution network data, which he would later hand to federal authorities and which would prove instrumental in coordinating supply routes to survivor camps across 4 states. The helicopter banked east toward a refugee processing center that had been established at Fort Leonard Wood. Below us, the world we'd known grew small and then disappeared entirely beneath the curve of the earth, and the first golden light of a sunrise that had no idea what it was illuminating. Dana leaned against my shoulder and closed her eyes. I kept mine open. Someone had to watch. They gave us cots in a gymnasium that smelled of floor wax and institutional hope. 200 survivors arranged in rows, each one carrying a geography of loss that could fill volumes. I lay awake that first night, listening to the breathing of strangers who'd become the only population that mattered. Dana slept beside me. Her ankle was properly splinted now, her map confiscated by military intelligence officers who studied it with the reverence of cartographers discovering a new continent. She'd given them everything: the routes, the patterns, the behavioral observations, and they'd listened with the particular intensity of people encountering civilian competence they hadn't expected. Gerald called me the following morning, not crying this time, quiet. He said 2 words: "Thank her." Then he hung up. I never did, not in the way he meant. There was no single moment grand enough to contain what she'd done. Instead, I thanked her in the language of continued living in every morning I woke beside her. In every decision I watched her make with that architectural mind. In every step we took together into the reconstruction of a world that had learned, too late, how much it needed people who understood how things connect. She didn't quit her job. She graduated from it. The outbreak just made sure everyone else noticed.